There are no sexual ethics. We have 4 fantastic guests. Emily Maguire has twice been named the Sydney Morning Herald Young Novelist of the Year. She's author of Princesses and Porn Stars, Sex, Power and Identity, and the novel Taming the Beast, amongst others. We have Tara Moss, of course, a Canadian-Australian author, journalist and TV host and general all-round vixen. She's worn leopard today. In fact, they're all wearing leopard in various parts you might not see. Her 9 crime thrillers include Fetish, Split, Assassin and The Spider Goddess, and she is a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, which she's been since 2007. We have Dan Savage. Who was at the Dan Savage session? Dan, of course, joins us from Seattle. He's the author of the syndicated sex advice column that many of you read, obviously, Savage Love, and the host of the cult podcast, The Savage Lovecast. With his husband, he founded It Gets Better to reach out to queer young people who are at risk of suicide, and his latest book is called American Savage. Christoph Chalkas, of course, wrote The Slap, which was turned into that wonderful ABC series. And it also won him the Commonwealth Writers' Award or Prize, and also his first novel, Loaded, you might remember, became that wonderful film with Alex Dimitriadis and that masturbation scene. Head On. And his 6th and newest novel is Barracuda. Give them all a big, hearty round of applause. Come on. What a treat of a panel. Where do we start? Let's start, I thought, with your ethical boundaries when it comes to sex. Can we get personal?
So you're easing us in slowly then.
That's right. Your ethical boundaries when it comes to sex, Tara.
That's very personal. I think I'd probably talk a little bit more broadly. First of all, the topic, there are no sexual ethics. Obviously there are. And I think most people here would agree that ethics apply in any interaction with another living creature. In fact, well, with just about anything. And the 2 basic questions are, is there consent and is there harm? I think that particularly applies with sexual ethics. Is there consent and is there harm? So I think most boundaries that I have about, I won't necessarily talk about my own sex life, that's fabulous. But when I hear about other people's lives, which of course we hear about a lot these days, there's a lot of very public moralizing about people's sex lives, we really just have to consider, is there consent? Are these 2 consenting adults? And I think beyond that, it's really no one's business.
I think we'll get into consent. Consent is so complex, isn't
it? It is, yeah.
Dan Savage.
Well, I would have to agree. I think consent is the beginning, middle, and end of sexual ethics. People are confused about sexual ethics, I think, because usually what people mean when they say there's no sexual ethics now is, I'm uncomfortable with this new model. I'm uncomfortable with these new ideas about how we should judge other people's sex lives. Because it used to be marital, vaginal, missionary, that was normal, that was good, and everything else, the further you got away from that, was judged to be immoral or unethical. And we've applied a new standard, which is, do the people there doing that want to do it? It is possible to have marital, vaginal, missionary position sex, that's rape, where there isn't consent. And however normal it looks, it's wrong, wrong, wrong. And it's possible to have like insane BDSM sex with somebody with their arm up somebody else's ass, and for there to be complete consent despite the bondage and the pain being inflicted, and that's right. And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, particularly people who felt that they were at some sort of moral advantage or somehow morally superior because they were having good and normal sex. And they don't like all these other people who are having crazy sex that used to be deemed immoral, crowding in with them into the good and moral circle. And then they say there are no sexual ethics. And what they mean is, I don't think you belong here with me. Even though what we're doing is exactly the same. 2 consenting adults having fun, nobody's being harmed, and this is pleasure for both of us. That's the standard. That's what we should, that is sexual ethics.
Well, it being the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, you mentioned rape, and we'll get to rape, I think, because in many ways, rape is being glorified on television screens, in ads, it's there, it's present. It's almost like it's not a no-go zone anymore, that somehow we're popularising.
Well, it's also glorified in a lot of our erotic imaginations. A lot of people are aroused by rape, by force scenarios, by power imbalances. So it's not just that film and television are sort of imposing rape scenarios on us against our will. They're catering to this human desire, this human fantasy, to live those things in a consensual, safe, and often fictitious way. The problem is when rape is actual rape, rape, as opposed to fictional portrayals, whether you're acting them out in your own sex life or it's being shown to you on television.
I'll come back to you on that in terms of pedophilia, the mental and the actual, because you've written some interesting things about that. Emily Maguire, your ethical boundaries.
My personal ethical boundaries, one of the key things is, ever since I've been a semi-public person in writing and talking about sex, is not to talk about my sex life now, out of ethical concern for my partner, who is a very private person. And beyond that, of course, what these guys have said, and I don't think there's going to be much disagreement on that point, that consent is at the heart of it. And yeah, there's this weird thing, like most people will actually say that, I think, about themselves, and consent's the most important thing. Where we get into trouble is this sense of this imposing morality on other people and putting meaning on other people's sexual acts and their sexual lives. So it's fine for me to say, well, this act, which is bizarre to you, is completely consensual for me and my partner, and someone else will say, no, it's not, you have a false consciousness and it's actually really degrading and you don't know. And so you get into this, on the surface question, if everyone's consenting, that's fine, and then you get into this thing where people go, but are you really consenting? And people wanting to impose their morality on that, which is where the conversation gets much messier.
Sure does.
Yeah.
Let's go there. Christos. Stumped.
No, I just was thinking about of course there are sexual ethics for me, and I really like what you said, Emily, about, because I'm in a relationship, and just the wariness of you don't want to necessarily drop your partner in it. Because I think sexual ethics in a relationship, whether it's a monogamous relationship or polyamorous or whatever the nature of the relationship is, that also requires thinking. What are the things that you will not do in a relationship that you need to respect? For us, quite clearly, violence is a no-go. But the whole issue, what attracted me to this session was that I actually find consent quite a complicated notion. So I won't talk about my relationship, but I'll talk. I started having sex in my mid-teens. I was 15. Most of my early sexual life was with older men, ranging from, when I say older, they may have been 17, 18 to, I don't know, men in their 40s. That was part of my actual sexual life. Now, I'm quite clear that I consented to that, but I have been confronted in situations where people have said, no, I didn't consent to that. I thought I was consenting to that back at 16 or 14 or whatever, but I haven't. And I find that area really, really difficult. What do we mean by consent then? And the last time where I had an encounter was a long, long time ago. I was in my that kind of made this present in my mind. Is I was about 27. I was in not in a very good state, but I don't think that mattered. But I was in a toilet block, and there was this most beautiful young person. And he made it obvious that he wanted to have sex with me, and I had that. I just thought, I wonder how young you are. And we started having sex. And I asked the question. I said, "How old are you?" And he said, "I'm 16." And it was like, now it wasn't my sexual ethics that were coming into play. I just thought, fuck the police. I'm being like that.
Like, I'll go fuck the police instead of this kid. Because there's no 16-year-old cops.
But yes, I'll leave that as the arena where I think that there is a discussion to have about sexual ethics and
who gets to define them and who gets to police them, and by what rules.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on consent?
Just on the issue of consent and what you were talking about, I find it quite interesting that the age of consent is different in different states, even within our own country. And curiously, when it comes to anal sex, there's one state where anal sex, you've got to be 18. that's not mentioned in any other states, just in Queensland. You know, and you wonder why.
The floodgates.
Yeah, that's right. So we're getting right into it here now. But it's interesting, in New South Wales it's 16, and in some other states it's 17. You know, you want to kind of go, oh, there's a law for this, so I can find my way through this moral minefield. But actually, it's not so simple as that. And again, you wonder why in Queensland is there a different age for consent for anal sex. And I can only imagine that it's because of the associations with homosexuality and this idea that that's just something homosexuals do and heterosexual people don't, which of course is incorrect.
Or the person who wrote the law had a 17-year-old daughter.
Yeah, or
like,
that's right. But,
ruling it out for her for now.
Yeah, that's right. Kind of, no, just for now. But you do kind of wonder how these particular laws come into play, and also how they stay. You know, how they last, and really what the state. Why does the state feel that it has a stake in the form of sexual interaction that's taking place between two adults? Because if it was two 16-year-olds or 17-year-olds in that state having what they would think of as heterosexual style sex, normal sex, whatever they want to call it, that wouldn't have been illegal. So I was quite surprised when I discovered that, and I guess from the audience reaction, not many of you knew either. And there probably are, you know, a lot of young people out there that actually don't know what the laws are or what kind of trouble they can get themselves into.
Any other thoughts on consent? Because, Christos, you raised some really interesting tensions there.
I wanted I lost my virginity at 15 to a 22-year-old woman, technically statutory rape. And I consented to it. And I think one of the things that happens as we get older and we get into middle age, I have a 15-year-old son now. I can't imagine him being sexually active, especially somebody in their 20s. It like appalls and mystifies me. And I think sometimes the older we get, we begin to doubt who we were at 15 and whether we could have consented. So consent that seemed clear to us at 15, I wanted to fuck her. I had to pretend she was Andy Gibb the whole time to get through it. I'm surprised anybody knows who I'm talking about when I say that. Oh, I'm in Australia. You know who I'm talking about. But now, you look back from like decades later and you go, no, you couldn't really. And it becomes grayer the further away from it you get, particularly at that stage of life, that early age. And I think that's just a function of like old fuddydism in middle age, that we begin to look at, we want, especially when you're parents, you want your kids not to be sexually active ever. And I know that I'm uncomfortable with that now in a little way. Like I couldn't have consented at 15 now. I know my son and his friends are all 15. But I think I actually did. And it's what I wanted. And I'm not sure I would want it now, knowing what I know now about sex and life and where I was. But at that moment, my consent was enthusiastic.
And that's actually the difficulty I have with the question of this question of consent and sexual ethics, and going to what you were saying, Tara, as well about the state. So, I now, there's so many sexual relationships and experiences I had as an adolescent and as a very young man that I regret, or I made mistakes that I wish I hadn't made. But that was part of how I learned a sexual life, and I actually think that I am a product of those and quite happy with those experiences in the long term. So I would have said, I would argue quite strongly, yes, I regret it, but I made those choices and I was consenting. What does the state do? Does the state go, well, then the age of consent, really, should we make it when our bodies are hormonally ready to have sex? That's what menstruation is, that's what ejaculation is. That is the body saying that we are sexual. Now, I think that, for everyone in the room, is the really difficult area.
So what if your son did get together with a 22-year-old now?
I'd kill him or her. And it's just totally different. And my parents found out that I had slept with this. That's the reason I fucked her. I wanted my parents to find out because I was trying to convince them I wasn't the faggot that I obviously was. So I fucked my older brother's girlfriend.
Oh!
It was really effective. It bought me 4 years.
Are you still friends with your brother?
What? Yeah, we're great friends.
Has he fucked your husband?
Did he fuck your husband?
Oh my God. I don't think he has, but I've left them both unsupervised in the United States. While I'm here, God, anything could happen. I don't know who would throw up more if that happened, my brother or my husband.
Yeah, I think the whole area in talking about teenagers and their ability to consent and the whole mess of it is really interesting, because a lot of my writing is for teenage girls and around teenage girls. And if you speak to them and the way they speak about their sexuality and what they want, it is almost as if they're living on a completely different planet than most of the adults who write op-eds or concern pieces or whatever else about teenage sexuality. The sexual lives of teenage girls actually have almost nothing to do with the adult world. They really don't, except for those instances where some of them are having sex with adults. But apart from that, they don't care what any of us think. Their ethics are being decided mostly amongst themselves, and they have mostly very strong moral codes, whether I agree with them or not, and varying from group to group. So it's something made among peers. You know, you talk to one group, you know, out near Hillsong and what their idea of sexual ethics are, they take them very seriously and they have a lot of examples to work through with you. And you talk to another group of girls at a, you know, in a city private school, wherever, they have their own set of ethics too. And it's quite tribal and it's quite specific and it's very carefully thought out. And they don't treat it flippantly. And you know what they see is these big op-ed spreads, do you know what your daughter's doing? Or Girls Gone Wild, and they're always illustrated with pictures of, you know, teenage thighs with tight little miniskirts on. And these girls notice that, they see that. I remember these 15-year-olds telling me they were at a cafe having lunch and they looked over the next table, these middle-aged people, you know, really like salivating over pages of their thighs and looking over at them, and it's fucking creepy. They feel so creeped out by this adult obsession with teenage sex. And there are really important conversations to have with teenagers about consent and negotiating consent and about safety and all of that. But there seems this adult obsession on how they're doing it and exactly, and blowjobs in the back of classrooms and this whole fantasy world of teenagers that has nothing to do with the conversations they're having amongst themselves, which are often really kind of sweet and tender and concerned about things like friendship and respect and all of those things. And it just is really bewildering to me, this gap between the conversation of adults around teenage sexuality and actual teenage sexuality.
But I did a forum earlier this year for Youth Week at Parliament House with a room full of high school students talking about sex. It seems to be sex is my thing this year. And they were really open and frank about some of the pressures that they were feeling. To boys and girls, actually, both spoke about this in this room. Strange sort of location for it, really. About feeling like somehow they had to perform like porn stars because that was the vibe they were getting, or because they were consuming or watching porn online or whatever way they're getting it, pretty much every way they can, it seems. And that was a real concern for them?
Yeah, it is. And that's why I think our responsibility as adults is to be that voice talking to them about porn in the sense of interpreting it. I mean, most high schools now, they have classes in, you know, media literacy where they learn about photo retouching and photoshopping and all that stuff and how to interpret ads, and to have something similar about porn. And I mean, the thing I always say to kids is like, porn is to sex what Glee is to school choirs. And you can get...
I am going to steal that.
You can get inspiration and you can get excited by it and think, yeah, I'm going to start a singing group at my school. But it's probably not going to be like that. And that's fine. They have professional performers, they have makeup people, and the same kind of thing about porn, talking about, okay, well, these positions are often chosen because of the camera angles that makes for a really good shot, not necessarily because that's what's going to feel best, and have those kind of conversations.
Well, and the rest,
exactly right. So the whole thing of literacy, instead of saying, you know, don't feel pressure, kids, which is, you know, it's too late for that. It's done.
But this is one thing I find kind of frustrating. I think every generation throughout history has probably moralised about the generations who are younger than them. And so we've gone, oh, they've got it all wrong. This isn't how we did it, and oh, they're going to get themselves into so much trouble. And their parents said that about them, and their parents said it about them. You know, I think we need to try to somehow separate that anxiety we have. And I've got a child. Of course, when she's a teenager, I'm going to have some anxiety about what experiences she's going to have, whether she's going to come to harm. But we need to somehow separate our anxiety in being a person who's aging, who's not part of this group, with the way that we have concern about real issues that are getting people in trouble. So, you know, yes, there are some legitimate things to talk about, but we really need to step back and realize we're not talking about us. This is something they're experiencing, and we need to listen to them And, which is something that you've done, and obviously you've done. But I think a lot of people who moralize about these issues really don't. Mm-hmm. They don't listen to young people. They don't say, what are your actual experiences? They get themselves tied into knots thinking about, blowjobs, Brazilians, miniskirt, like the concern levels.
But you don't have to listen to them because they don't actually want to tell you anything.
Yeah.
So
actually, that's
you can
not
say, I want to
entirely
listen
true.
to you, but your kid's going to sit there staring at you until you shut up and go away.
Your kids
Especially when it's a
don't even,
conversation.
they might tell me,
Someone else.
an
That's
outsider.
true.
Yeah.
So
I
as
certainly get
adults, we
letters
can
from
have a
them.
role. It might be hurtful as a parent if your kid completely shuns you and just cringes whenever you try and be the cool parent.
I could talk
but
to my parents
other
about
adults can
sex.
do that. Aunts, uncles.
There are some people who can. I could talk to my parents about sex, and I still can. But
I still can't.
There you go. Some people can't.
Sorry. Yeah.
As long as they have someone that they can
Yeah.
talk to, and someone who has, an understanding of the issue, isn't just going to run off with this sort of moralizing flag, going, danger, danger, danger. What you're wearing is going to get you raped, or how dare you engage in something that we wouldn't have done in the 50s. We need to try to separate our own ideas about things and actually look at issues of consent and harm. Try to make it a bit more simple. Is my child going to be okay at the end of this? Hey, we've all done things when we were younger and that we wouldn't necessarily do now, but
Like Wanda.
they got us here.
Chris,
Because I was thinking about what Emily was saying, and I think you're absolutely, that thing of being an adult man and he's in middle age now, and kind of that I can't necessarily evoke from my own experience what it is like now for someone who's 16, 17, and I think that is really, in terms of my own sexual. If I've got a sexual, I can't sleep with a young person, and I don't actually know what that means. I would say, even a 23-year-old in a way at the moment, they would feel so young to me. It's just that I have a sense of that they're still working out those questions they need to ask. But I do think as an adult, you can
they can give consent.
Eh?
They are in a position to give consent.
Oh, of course.
So
And
that's
I
not the issue.
No, but I was just thinking of the
But in your personal ethics, it can
in
be
my
to
own
not.
personal ethics,
Yeah.
it's a very good one, Natasha, because where I am is that I've made this choice, but I would fight for someone who is condemned by that choice, who hasn't made the same choice as I have. I mean, that's of course that's a complication. What I was just thinking when Tara was speaking as well. I had this great session 5 years ago where I was in a state suburban school in Melbourne, but it was largely Muslim girls, and with the last year level, and I was meant to be talking about writing. It became about contraception. What do you do when your brother's gay? What do you do when your sister's lesbian? What do you do when you want to have sex? And sometimes, and that is what you recognise as the adult. There's a responsibility to actually listen, and that you may be able to give advice that's not there ready for them, or that sometimes they can't hear it from the mother or the father. They have to hear it from somewhere else. I think.
But it's still a foundation.
Yes. Yeah.
That's what you hope anyway as a parent, that you can give them a foundation where it's okay to talk about things. They might be embarrassed when you bring it up, but it's okay to talk about things, and then maybe it's a little easier for them to talk about it with someone else. I think probably throughout history, people have let each other down by not talking about particular topics. The fact that talking about sex has been taboo has caused a lot of people real damage. And now that we're able to talk about it and sit here on a stage and talk about sex, I see that as very positive. It doesn't mean
But also
everyone's going to
being
agree.
kind of forced to talk about it or to, confess to things has caused people a lot of damage over time too, if what they're
I know
doing.
getting me here was
and so
very
that's-
difficult. I was forced to come on the stage.
So
No.
we haven't actually talked about sex. We're talking about relationships and relational things. We haven't got into the gritty.
But sex is one of those, intense, relational, intimate things. I mean, it's one of the most intimate interactions you'll have with a human being. And particularly if it's a long-term relationship, but even if it's a one-off, it's extremely intimate. So, of course, we're talking about other human beings and talking about relationships. You can't make love or have sex with someone if you're only doing it to your own mirror. If you're not aware of the real person or some aspect of that person being a real human being. They're not a concept you're having sex with, they're a person. So that's why, obviously, ethics are extremely important, and also why communication, I'd argue, is very high on the priority list.
So let's think about if they were a concept, and distinguishing between fantasy as an imagination and action. And this is something, Dan, I think you've done? In the 22 years that you've been writing this column, when it comes to pedophilia, you have decided to distinguish between fantasies and action. How?
I wrote a column called Gold Star Pedophiles, because what people do when they talk about pedophilia is they conflate pedophiles with child molesters. A child molester is a pedophile who's offended. Most pedophiles, and it's hard to get stats on this, haven't offended, and they struggle all their lives, and it is, and this is really explosive sometimes when you say it is a sexual orientation. Nobody says, I think I'm going to be attracted to kids. I think that's what I want for my life, right? And there's all this really great research coming out of Queen's University in Ontario about pedophilia and the brain and how this works. And this is a tragedy that fell on someone to be attracted to children, to have this desire that can never be acted upon in any ethical or moral way. And we need to provide support to people who are pedophiles, who are not offending. And you can't provide that person support if the stigma is so enormous, legally and socially, that person cannot ask for help in the struggle to not offend all their lives. And if we can make that distinction between people who are attracted to children and people who fuck children, we will save children from being fucked, because we'll be able to help the people who have not yet fucked kids who are attracted to kids. So we have to be able to talk about it.
When someone writes to you about pedophilic fantasies, what do you do?
I tell them they can never act upon this. You refer them, if they're in Canada, you say, God, I'm so glad you're in Canada, because in the United States we have laws where if you tell someone, if you go to a shrink, they're required to report you to the police if you tell them you're a pedophile and you have any contact at all, incidentally, in your life with children. If you are a teacher, if you are a parent, if you are a coach, if you're anything. And when you think about sort of adult middle-aged life, almost all of us have contact with children. So we've created a situation in many US states where people who are pedophiles can't get psychological help, can't get support. And there's also, chemical castration, which sounds really draconian, but for some people who struggle with these desires, it is a relief to be released from them.
Sort of hormonally muted.
Yes.
Is that common? Is that a common practice?
It's hard to get data on it because people aren't out, but it does happen in Canada. People do opt for chemical castration.
With my crime novels, I'm usually looking at the criminal end of this particular conversation, and I know that with things like chemical castration, when it comes to an offender who has been, say, brutally raping women, for instance, it doesn't stop them from wanting to attack women. In fact, they may use objects to have a similar effect, because it's about power and not about sex per se. So that's a very different. Instances. Yeah.
Can I ask what is the definition there, Guy? I mean, and in terms of what is paedophilia? Because I've had that. Oh, thank God I'm not a pedophile. I'm like, thank God I don't look at a 7-year-old and get a hard. I mean, seriously, I just think. I'm sorry, but I recently had to write an article for a queer magazine where I talked about, just being older and how desirable the teenager is. As you get older and your body sags and ages, and you look at youth and you go, my God, they're beautiful. They are absolutely gorgeous. They don't, that. Now, is that paedophilia?
No, it's not paedophilia. Pedophilia is to be attracted to prepubescent children.
Okay, so I just wanted to make that clear because I think there is a... No, for my answer.
But people do that, particularly people do that to gay men.
That's exactly...
when a gay guy jokes about a high school wrestling team, he gets called a pedophile, right?
Yeah.
When a straight guy jokes about rushing home to watch the 15-year-old girls in the Olympics do the jumping around, usually pedophile is not the charge that's laid at his feet.
I think that there has been a change in the culture, and I don't know how you all feel about it, but I actually think that has become more of a difficult subject to have. Oh, certainly when I was growing up, that the adult men would make jokes about the women's gymnasts. I don't think that we are as comfortable about that now. I think we find... do you think I am...
No, I mean, I think that's probably right. I think the comments that you hear about teenage girls and their bodies are often ones that are that sort of the absolute other side of that. They're like a total kind of shaming, how can they be dressed like that, or how are they showing themselves off like that? Like you hear so many things about, well, they really have to wear that for their dancing concerts, or do they really, and even with younger kids too. There's so many letters to the editor I've read about. I went along to my local school's dancing concert and these 8-year-olds had on lipstick and hot pants and it was completely inappropriate. And there's a real policing of anything from little kids right through into the teens that could possibly be interpreted by anyone as sexual. And that becomes really, really a big problem when you get to teenagers, because they actually are sexual. And the idea that a girl, say a straight girl, wants to wear something that she thinks will make a boy attracted to her sexually, that means she's somehow kind of damaged, or she's a dupe of pornified culture, or that she's been sexualised by the adult world, when what she is a heterosexual girl who wants to have boys be attracted to her.
Who's coming into her own sense of sexual power.
We're putting this big message on her as adults that we are so scared of sexualising, that we put this interpretation on girls going out trying to look hot.
I do have a problem with the constant use of the word sexualized, because we put it on almost entirely onto the female. We don't really look at young men in board shorts walking down the beach and go, he's so sexualized, you know, that poor thing. The pressure, the pressure from culture that he has to show his body in that way for attention, you know, like it's something we really do project onto people. And, you know, what is the difference between sexualized and being a sexual being? You know,
because we look at young women and think they shouldn't be sexual at all.
That's right.
Because sexuality is imposed on women from the outside,
asexual.
And it can't come from the inside.
No,
that's right.
No.
Yeah, and it's a classic phrase. You're denying someone their agency. You're denying them actually being a human being. You say they don't actually have any of their own interests. They're blank canvas, and we're projecting onto them something quite strange. Like, I think was it Gwyneth Paltrow designed some like bikini for her child, or she went out to a beach and her child had someone's nodding. Her child had a bikini on. It's a two-piece swimsuit. It was like, wow, she's sexualizing her little girl. You know, I thought, what is going on? That even the naked body is not essentially sexual. It's also.
I think she'd have been in more trouble if the child was naked.
Well, yeah.
They may have even been.
That's also true.
How dare she?
Take
well, I wonder about that. Probably not. We probably still accept little children and nakedness.
Yeah. Oh God, I would like to think so.
Wouldn't
but
you?
I don't know that that's true.
But as soon as we put something that seems very adult on them, suddenly they're
But what's
sexual
adult
beings.
about a bikini? You're showing your midriff. It's not like there's nothing essentially sexual about the body except what we project onto it, apart from the sex organs. You know, and this is something I come across all the time in my work for advocacy for breastfeeding mothers. The fact that it is the breast that is being used to feed their child creates this entirely fraught conversation where it's, you know, people are like, my God, she's whipping them out, it's disgusting, you know. This kind of conversation, you think, you do know that's what they're for. And they're, you know.
I was wondering. All these years.
We'll
talk later. We'll talk later.
Christos.
I was thinking about that, and I do apologise. There may be someone in the audience that about 10 years ago there was a Western Australian artist, a really good photographer, and she photographed her children. Yeah. And she got charged with child pornography. I mean, that's why I was thinking about that arena about the naked child. Now, and to go to your questions you want to ask about the state, Tara, I mean, what is that really disturbs me. If there is an area of danger that I think in our, I'm talking about Australia here, Dan, but contemporary politics around art and that is that's changing. What we can, there's that in Melbourne there was an artist who did collages of pornography, and then he placed. He cut out children's heads from the magazines and placed them on top of the body. Now, he's been charged with child pornography. I may not necessarily think that's great art, but I think it's really dangerous when that becomes child pornography.
But also it's even conversations about sex then become impossible, because art is essentially, or one version of art, or one philosophy around art is that it's a conversation. It's supposed to stimulate public thought. So if we remove all public thought about things that are actually happening in the real world, like sex or adolescent sexuality, blossoming sexuality, if you will, then, you know, we're not only denying that young people have sex or want to have sex, but there's a whole conversation there that isn't taking place, and damage, I think, is going to result from that.
Can I say something really dangerous about child pornography? There's all these studies now that the data's in. You know, when I went to college in the 80s, porn is the theory, rape is the practice. That was the buzz term on campus, that pornography inspires people to rape and cranks up people's really aberrant desires and makes the world less safe for women. And as we have now been buried in a tsunami of pornography, as internet made pornography ubiquitous and available everywhere, the rates of sex crimes have actually plummeted. And they were able to track states in the United States, as online pornography became available, as states went online, their rape and sexual assault stats
How do you know there's a correlation,
begin to fall.
though? You don't necessarily know that there's a direct correlation.
They believe that there is. There's a terrific article in Scientific American about it. Because of that, like online porn became widely available in California and rape fell, but not in Nevada, where it was not available yet. As soon as it came online in Nevada, rape and sexual assaults began to fall there, because a lot of people who had been out committing sex crimes were home jacking off. And porn was meeting these needs that some people could only get met by...
Which those porn scenes might be fulfilling a rape fantasy.
Right. So, pedophiles.
And this correlates with
pedophiles who are out there raping kids. Would it not be potentially better, knowing what we know about the availability of hardcore and sometimes insanely hardcore porn, and how that has led to, directly correlated strongly, but believed to be led to a drop in sex crimes being committed against adult women, perhaps there should be child porn made available to, not child porn of actual kids, but representations, drawings, images that we could draw a distinction between child porn that involved the trafficking of or the actual physical assaults and rape of children, and child porn that depicts these things. Because we've made it illegal to draw... If you
thought that correlation mapped from adults back to...
Right. We've made it illegal
behavior.
for a pedophile to own an image of a child, right? And because in his eyes, it's going to be child porn. And it actually dangerous idea. It might make kids safer from pedophiles if there was some stream of pornography that pedophiles were allowed to create and consume. Drawings, Photoshop. But we say, no, nothing, ever. And if pedophiles were home jacking off to porn that didn't actually create a demand that led to the harm of actual living children, this is a thing I think about. Like
and it's
the coming
a festival of dangerous ideas.
The coming of the sex bots. Like, we are getting to sex robots. And this is going to be great for people who are centaur fetishists, because you will be able to go to you will able to one day be able to fuck a centaur, right? And this is a real thing. People out there have centaur fetishes. They feel they're unfulfilled all their lives sexually because they've never been able to get fucked by a centaur. People talk about the coming of the sex bots as if it's going to be weird when you find out your neighbor's wife is actually a robot. No, it's going to be weird as when you find out your neighbor's wife is a centaur. So
it's hard to hide that, I find.
Yeah. What about the robot child sex toy? What about that?
Emily?
Yeah, I haven't read all that research, so I'm not going to comment on that. I guess one thing that I wonder about in a lot of the porn research that I have read with adults is about the kind of normalising or familiarising effect that pornography can have. And I'm talking about in a really positive way in terms of queer sexualities. Or, I mean, pornography, for all the negative things we can say about it, and I can say a lot if I'm asked to, there's also this aspect where it's pretty much the only medium where you actually have a full scope of the glorious variability of human bodies and sexualities and their expressions. And there can be something almost life-saving, you know, for a queer teen stuck in a country town that's, you know, in terms of social policy 80 years backwards, to actually, it doesn't even have to be a celebration of their sexuality, a demonstration of it where it becomes normalised and not so terrifying and not so horrifying. And for even people who don't identify with that, the more they watch pornography that might be a little bit to the edge of what they're normally into, it can kind of normalise sexualities and body types and all of that in being sexual creatures. So I suppose if I were to start delving into this research, that would be my big question about child pornography, even if it doesn't harm children in the making, if that could be something that we would need to worry about.
But can't we research this by just looking at Japan? I mean, if you look, I mean, they already have sort of quasi-rape tentacle
and
creatures
very low rates of sexual assault, sexual violence.
But
was
also
that reported?
But recorded, very low rates of crime in general. But how much of it is reported is the question. So, you know, we can probably look more closely at that. Again, I didn't read this piece in Scientific American, but it does strike me that we have some models to look at that already exist in society. You can't spend very long in Japan without kind of seeing someone sitting on the subway reading something, or reading or looking at, enjoying a cartoon of a schoolgirl in a classic schoolgirl outfit with a tentacled creature raping her. It is not uncommon, and it's such a fantasy. It's so far removed that there's a level of acceptance in that sort of conversation. It's not like
So
they're
it
going to go.
can't be normalised to the effect that people are going to do it, can it?
Well, that's right. They can't kind of go, I so want to get me one of those tentacled creatures.
But you
Until
can't.
the coming of the tentacled
Until the
sex
coming-
bots.
Yeah. They'll have to do it much better than they did in the old Dracula films. Look, I do think there's probably, in terms of that conversation, there probably are models that we can look at, or social situations that have unfolded that we can look at more closely to try to get some answer.
Just as you think of that question, I think we should open it up to questions as well. So just while we're continuing, if you'd like to move to the microphones.
On tentacles, we'll just open up the room to questions.
Exactly. And there's a mic there and there's a mic
The way
there. And
tentacles
thank you
open up
for
Japanese
taking your
schoolgirls.
spots. We'd love your input and your questions. And I just need to let the organisers know that the clock stopped, disappeared, went black.
Yeah, we don't
so
see
I'm
it.
assuming
time.
we've got 15 minutes. Oh,
It's
there
back.
it is.
20.
We've got 20 minutes. Fantastic.
20 minutes.
You only had to ask, Natasha.
Christos.
Oh, just really quickly, but I was really fascinated by thinking about that, because I would say I have, and because I've just heard the statistics on the research, I would have no problem if it was clear scientifically that for people who were pedophiles and had wanted to have sex with children, that they were able to get off on simulated child pornography, and that would work. I'd have absolutely no problem. I think part of the problem is that even having that debate gets so difficult at the moment because of the terror and the fear and the hysteria. From my own experience, I think that, I consume pornography, and there is sometimes you just have to go, for me, I'll just stop here. I just think if I keep, because it does, and I don't want to say that my own experience says anything about how it really works, but that you do start opening up to kind of fantasies that you worry about. You just go. For me, it's been about rape fantasies, and I know that we all have those fantasies, and I'm not at all. I don't find that the problem, but they are real bodies. And the pornography that I see that uses those real bodies, you're so conscious that they're Eastern European bodies, or it's the trafficking aspect of pornography that's the real challenge, I think. For me, rather than the representation. I actually I don't care about the representation. I care about how the porn industry works.
Yeah. Should we take some questions? Go for it. Thank you.
Tapping into what Dan said earlier about how paedophilia can be like a sexual orientation that no one has chosen to take on, but also tapping into the idea that we are here to talk about very dangerous ideas. The social understanding of homosexuality in the past has been very similar to some of the expressions that you use today in terms of pedophilia and the fact that that homosexual people were not able to talk about their sexual orientation and it wasn't accepted, etc. So in that line, do you think that, and please understand that I'm not placing homosexuality in the same branding as pedophilia. Please understand that.
Yeah. And I was thinking
one
that
I think
myself.
is very acceptable, the other no. But do you think that it could happen in the future that pedophilia become accepted in the way that homosexuality has today?
I think it's impossible because a child cannot consent, period, the end. A prepubescent child cannot consent, period, the end. I don't, the way that homosexuality was normalized, which is having to acknowledge this is something that two consenting adults are doing, and there's no harm in it. No one is being harmed, only pleasure is being created. Someone is always being harmed when an adult is fucking a 7-year-old. And it is impermissible. It can never be normalized. That's why you'd say it's a sexual orientation that can never be acted on in any ethical or moral way, because there is always a victim. When two dudes who want to get it on, there's no victim.
I think that's probably true of all sexual orientations that that are illegal because of issues of consent, zoophilia, necrophilia. These are no-go zones, and there's no reason why that will ever change, because it's an issue of consent. That's really clear. An animal can't consent. A person who's passed away has not consented. They can't consent, and a child
What if they consent in advance?
An advanced sex directive.
Wow, you'd really want to lawyer that up, I reckon.
In Jesse Baring's new book, Perv, he lays out this test about necrophilia, where so there's a necrophilia club, and people join this club because they're necrophiliacs, and they will their bodies to the club to use after their death, just once, so that there's no disease issue, right? And so, do we have a problem with that? Because then you get to this point where it's a moral condemnation.
Well, then there's consent, though. Right? No, but you just.
But there is consent.
You just said there's consent.
There is
so obviously
consent.
There's consent. But I can't imagine mass sort of necrophilia clubs.
No, I can't either.
Springing up around the country. I'm just saying.
But just as a thought experiment.
I don't want to judge it. I'm just saying it's unlikely that you're going to have consent coming from a lot of people.
No, but there is a scenario under which there could be consensual necrophilia, and if consent is the be-all and end-all, and the beginning and the end, and the alpha and the omega, there is, we can conceive of consensual necrophilia.
Sure. Well, I mean,
even if nobody wants to do it.
But thinking of this panel brought me to the lovely and charming topic also of cannibalism, in that case in Germany, where there was consent. But then you look at that scenario and you say, there's consent, but there's also harm.
Yes.
I mean, there is irreparable harm. You cannot reverse the harm of taking off parts of a person's body that they're never going to get back and killing them so that you can eat them to fulfill a fantasy. So again, you do have this baseline. I know, it's a lovely conversation, really, isn't it? But you have this baseline, you have consent and harm, and I think those are not clear-cut in every case. And as we've talked about on this panel, those are tricky areas, but those are the two main things to focus on. And I think a lot of these conversations, to do with pedophilia, because there can't be consent, it can't occur in a truly ethical way.
And also, consent might come from a place of damage. A person might consent to an act that might harm them, might give them pleasure, but that consent might be coming from a place of baggage or otherwise.
The point you raised about false consciousness.
Yeah. Christos.
I was actually... Sorry, I know just in two ways now of where to go, but I just wanted to, because I was thinking of your question when Dan was speaking before. And I've been reading a lot and going back to histories of sexuality, and one thing you do find, and I think actually there was some damage done in the 70s and 80s by an over-concentration on sex and divorcing it from concepts of love and how historically they were treated. And homosexual, lesbian relationships, the transgendered body as much as it could in the ancient world and non-Western civilizations, intersex, they are there in the historical record. They've been silenced, it's been evaded, but they are there. Most cultures have the taboo about fucking children. That's just seen as, and I think I think a lot of damage has been done by a misreading of ancient Greek sexuality as well. In the democratic state, it wasn't a child. It was actually a youth and an adult man. Where the real damage was done to slaves, they could do whatever they wanted to slaves. But I think that's important because we forget those histories, and I think that may help answer.
It's complex though, isn't it? Because child brides are very common in many countries, and that's an institutionalised sanctioning of rape, child rape, isn't it? Within a framework.
Yes, but I also think
marriage.
I mean, I'm a little bit. Of course, child brides are. We look at it and we think this is unbelievably savage and obscene. But I'm also.
Sometimes there are also child grooms as well. I mean, some arranged marriages are between two children.
And you had cultures. It is about history and culture. I mean, just to give it a context, like just the other month I was in Greece with one of my cousins who is my age. Amazing man. It was so good to catch up. I've told so many friends about this story. He was 11 when he left the village. That's where the circumstances of, post-World War Southern Europe. At 11, he had to get a job. He had to get his own apartment that he was sharing. He started a relationship with a woman who was a few years older than he was. He was what we would call an adult functioning being at 11, 12, 13 because he had to be. And that's, I mean, I'm not at all making an excuse for child brides, but I think history and culture...
We've drawn the line at different ages and different...
Yeah.
Let's take another question. Hi, thank you.
Hi. Thanks, everyone. This is a really engaging panel. And I'd just like to ask a question about formalised sex education and what you think the place or the ethics surrounding discussion of pleasure and desire are. What is the importance of teaching kids in school about the various types of pleasure and desire that they might have? I know that my sex education at school had absolutely nothing to do with that whatsoever. So yeah, I'd like to hear your opinions.
And that was something that came up with those kids in that room. They all said, we want to actually talk about why sex is fun and how you can have fun and, go for it.
There's a study out of the UK that found that all these teenagers who were sexually active, many of them, particularly the girls, were having sex that they didn't enjoy, that was painful and not pleasurable, because they didn't know sex was supposed to feel good, because that wasn't covered. Because sex ed was reproductive biology, and nobody talked about 99.99% of the sex that humans have, which is for pleasure. We leave pleasure out of the sex ed curricula, and then children are harmed by it. That's the difficult part. Reproductive biology is easy. Any idiot can make a baby. Sarah Palin made 5. The difficult, where people get in trouble with sex is negotiating consent, asking for what you want, understanding what you want, being solicitous of your partner and their desires, how to talk somebody into fucking you and how to be a good lay. That's the huge thing that we skip over in sex ed to the damage of all these kids. But I don't know if we could have that kind of sex ed in school.
How would we have that conversation?
I don't know.
Because the question was...
I think
the question was about the ethics of having that conversation.
We come from a real basis, right, of actually acknowledging female desire, that it exists, and that girls and women do, in many different circumstances, enjoy having sex. I mean, this is something I've written about. My sex ed at school, we were told all about how horny boys get, wet dreams, the mechanics, as well as all the feelings, and then we were told girls might feel a bit funny. And then we went on to, ovaries and all the reproductive side. Now, I've written about this at length. I was so fucked up by that because I had sexual feelings and I thought, I'm a fucking boy. Which would have been fine if I had gender identity, right? But there was no context to that. And you know what the alternative is for a girl who feels like that but doesn't have gender confusion in other ways is the only alternative is to be a slut. Because there's no feeling of being normal that you actually have sexual feelings. And the only way to actually satisfy them is often with completely inappropriate people, older people who don't have your best interests at heart. No mention either that it's perfectly normal to have desire and to feel sexual as a girl. No mention, I'm not saying we need instruction on how to masturbate, but the fact that it's a perfectly fine option would be a start. Well, it would be a start to even acknowledge that it exists for girls, right? And to start from there, and this goes into something, this isn't just about girls feeling sad or confused, it goes right to a conversation about rape and consent. Because you ask anyone, do you think it's okay to force someone to have sex against their will? Everyone's going to say no. But then we get into the guts of it and we have all these conversations of what if, what if, what if, what if. If you're young, you're working from a baseline of girls don't enjoy sex anyway. The only way they're going to have it is if they're coerced, given a few vats of vodka, or given amazing promises of true love, and otherwise they're not going to do it, then your actual baseline of going into that is to convert a no to a yes. And if she just lies there or looks uncomfortable or is teary afterwards, then isn't that normal? Because girls don't really like sex anyway. It's really dangerous.
Oh, great. Fantastic. Why don't we teach masturbation? It is the safest form of sex you can have. Unless it involves a sharp implement.
I think we all...
And it might, I don't know.
I think we all know the reason for that, though. I mean, since the Middle Ages, there's been, probably before then as well, there's been moralising about pleasure. I mean, all pleasure In fact, the only accepted pleasure probably is a beer. Anything else, really, you start to get a lot of very public moralizing about people's behaviors because they feel good. Even in the discussion of, say, legalization of marijuana, it's always around medical use. It can't be because people just want to feel good for a little while.
And we should teach masturbation for two really important reasons, because people can really damage themselves masturbating in inappropriate ways. There are boys who put their penises between mattresses and box springs or hump the floor to masturbate, and then they arrive at partnered sex, and the inside of a woman doesn't feel like a mattress and box springs that's crusted with 8 years of cum. Who knew? And also, when we not acknowledging or teaching female masturbation, boys arrive at partnered sex experts on their dicks. They know exactly how their dicks work, what a plateau feels like, what the point of inevitability feels like. They know what they need, right? Girls, because they're convinced that they're not even sexual at all, many don't masturbate at all, and they arrive at partnered sex and they look at this teenage boy and they go, okay, make me cum. And a girl who isn't an expert on her own junk isn't going to be able to derive pleasure from being with somebody else, and that can really screw up a young woman's sex life for a very long time.
It's heartbreaking, isn't it?
And hilarious, apparently.
Time, folks. Who's a parent? Put your hands up. How's sex ed going?
Oh, wow.
We've given you some frank ideas today.
Well, one thing I will say,
but I do want to come to questions.
Sorry, just quickly, in the run-up for this session, they say 50 Shades of everything, and I think we're all sick of hearing about 50 Shades. But I will say that when they started calling it mummy porn, I kind of liked it only because they were acknowledging that women who are mothers might actually like porn, or might actually like a conversation about sex, something about sex.
Or might like BDSM.
Even. Precisely. So I think that there's a lot more that needs to happen in terms of the conversation. But even the fact that we can throw out these terms, sure, we might get annoyed that it's always the same one, but it's an acknowledgement that once you become a parent, especially as a woman, your sex desire, your that part of you as a human being that wants to have sex has not disappeared.
That's right. Okay, so what I'm going to do is take a few questions at a time, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
So hold your thoughts.
Okay, as I was listening to this panel, I'm seeing this constant cycle happening where representation such as porn leads into glamorization, such as Tumblr blogs, and people actually fantasizing about these things leading into acceptance, such as the repressed society of Japan creating tentacle porn as a result of being so repressed. If you see it like that, where do you see the future of us seeing that things such as BDSM or, 50 Shades of Grey is so acceptable to read now in public? What do you think is the future of sexual ethics?
What do you think is the future of sexual ethics?
Yes.
Yeah? Is that the question?
Yes.
Great, okay. Hold that thought and I'll grab another question if I can. Do a few at a time.
Yeah, my question revolved around one thing that I was told often as a younger student was that sexual acts such as necrophilia or pedophilia was incorrect. Literally a mental illness. You were doing an inhuman thing. You were wrong. And as someone who's come to understand more so mental illness from a personal experience, and told that when you wake up and you feel sad and all you want to do is close all the doors, that's wrong. You don't actually feel like that. That's that disease you have. That's depression. Don't worry about that. That's not part of you. At what point those feelings of wanting to say fuck a little boy, is that still part of you, or is that something else? Is that a disease that you're struggling with, or is that something you can overcome? At what point does mental illness kind of cross over with
just
sexuality?
because something's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders does not mean it's not part of you.
No, and they don't always get it right.
It doesn't mean that it's not part of you. I wouldn't say that because something is listed by a psychologist that it exists in a vacuum. So I would question that as a concept.
Oh, of course, I'm mainly referring to mental illness as something that can be overcome almost, or something that you can learn to.
You mean a thing to get rid of?
Exactly, as literally in the definition of disease, which is something that is bad as part of you, which is it harms you exactly for whatever reason, and it is me harming myself, as we can all relate to. In that sense, what point does sexuality kind of mingle with mental illness or disease in its most purest form?
I don't know if it can always be teased out. I don't know if it can always be separated.
It's been really difficult history too, because for many years homosexuality was in the psychiatrist's Bible, the DSM at the time. So,
but I think a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists also talk about functionality. If you can be a functional human being, that is the line that a lot of people talk about in terms of whether someone is bipolar or they've got another, depressed. Can they function? How much of a problem do you have? If you can function, then it's something in you that you need to manage. If you can't function, then you need help. I think that's what a lot of doctors tend to consider is the line.
I'd love to address your question quickly about the future of sexual ethics. What does it mean that we live in a world where sort of BDSM has been mainstreamed? I think that's all about what we talked about at the very top, about consent and harm, and weighing those two things against each other is really the standard by which all sex acts and sexual sort of relationships can be judged. So if it's consensual BDSM, if there's mutual pleasure and enjoyment there and no one's being harmed by it, and there are studies out now that show that people who are into BDSM are as happy and healthy and well-adjusted, and often slightly better well-adjusted if they're actualizing their desires and realizing them in a healthy, constructive way. That means that, the reason why we're able to be more open about BDSM now is because we're judging it through this new sort of criteria around what's legit and what's positive and what's healthy, which is not about it has to look a certain way to be good. It has to be vaginal, missionary, marital sex to be good, but it has to work a certain way to be good. It has to be consensual, and there has to be harm, or it has to be harmless, or no one has to be being harmed. So BDSM is totally legitimized. I'm old and gay, and I remember when AIDS happened, and AIDS really turned the world upside down because we suddenly had to start talking about what people were actually doing, not what we all agreed people ought to be doing. And there was this one day where everyone realized, oh, these kinky motherfuckers with their dungeons and their beating each other up, that's safer than just anal intercourse. That's safer than penetrative vaginal intercourse. This stuff that we thought was crazy and dangerous is suddenly exonerated and safe, this fantasy play stuff. And that really led to, I think, this new world where we can talk about all these kinks, all these variances in desire without stigmatizing them.
Now, we are running out of time. We've got a good 10 seconds or so. I just wanted to take a very quick flood of questions and then we'll get a wrap through the panel. Go.
Okay, hopefully this takes less than 10 seconds. You talked a lot about sort of naturalising acts in pornography, whether it's kind of a demonstration for a kid in rural Australia, or you talked about the research as well that kind of dropped sexual violation or illegal sexual acts with the online access to pornography and mainstream pornography. But I was wondering if you'd just comment on kind of expectation that comes with that, and how much you think that just because pornography became online access and therefore a young man or young woman or old man or old woman sees someone going, okay, they did that many times with that duck, that means that I have to do that because they told me that I should.
Yeah.
So does that, do you think, correlate to the amount of sexual crimes that decreases because expectation therefore increased? They thought I have to do that because of that. Okay. For young and old people as well.
Okay, and let's just take one more, and that's all we've got time for. I'm really sorry.
Well, sexual ethics are often discussed by reference to limitation.
Come on the mic a bit more,
the
thanks.
presence of consent or the absence of harm. I would be very interested to hear the panel define a sexually ethical life by reference to possibility. What is a sexually ethical purpose and object?
Pleasure, communication.
Let's get a final comment from all of you in response to those last two, and anything else you'd like to wrap up with, just really briefly if you can. Yeah, great.
Look, I actually want to go back to the sexual ethics question. What is the future of sexual ethics? And just to really quickly say that it will also, it will not only be worked out in forums here in the Anglophone world. Like it's going to. I mean, I think one of the challenges of the future of sexual ethics is how it's going to be translated in different languages, in different cultures, and what kind of sexual ethics is the global future going to look like. I think that's the real challenge that I see. A sexual ethics for me is about care and about. I think Tara's absolutely right about pleasure and exploration and an openness to the possibility that that there can be so many permutations of sexual desire and sexual expression and sexual self, but. I can't separate sexual ethics from love, and I've got no answer to that except that seems to be the challenge for me at the moment. I'm still working that out.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you, Emily.
Really hard to sum up on all of that, but I think one thing that I wanted to say that we haven't really got to and that takes in a lot of this is to do with the impossibility of actually safeguarding against harm in every case. And I'm thinking especially emotional harm. A lot of the time the big heartbreaks in life will come no matter how careful you are, however ethical, however much communication, because what it comes down to, we can put all these ideas in place, and I think it's really important that we do and have our education and have our conversations. But, you know, humans are really fucking complicated, and love is amazingly mysterious, and so is sexual attraction. And so sometimes we've just got to go in knowing that you know, there is risk involved, and that most of the time, like risk with travel or anything else, that it's going to be worth it. And we put our safeguards in place, and then we have to let go a little bit, I think.
Yep.
Dan?
I think porn can give people ideas. Certainly people have watched types of pornography and gone, I want to do that, I want to try that. I run a porn festival in Seattle that started tonight. I'm not there for the first weekend because I came here. And every year I have to watch a couple of 100 5-minute porn clips, and I've watched so much cunnilingus in the last 10 years, and I do not want to perform cunnilingus. So porn does not always instill desire, but I think porn can tap into something that's already there, and you can find a new way to express a particular kind of sexual act that was already speaking to you. I think the sexual ethic, in a positive sense, I call it the campsite rule in my column, which is that the campsite rule for campsites is leave them in better shape than you found them. And I think that's a thing that we can apply to our relationships.
Yeah.
You may not be with somebody forever. You may not be with somebody tomorrow that you met today, but you can still leave them in better shape than you found them by you're not passing along a sexually transmitted infection, no unplanned pregnancies, no promises that you know you will not keep or cannot fulfill. And if you can have an encounter or have a relationship or have a marriage of many decades, where at the end of it you can look at what you created with this person intimately, sexually, and say this was a net gain for both of us. It was positive for both of us. We've both been left in better shape than when we first met, when we came together. Even if the only thing that's been created is a moment of transcendent pleasure, I think that's the positive in the sexual ethic.
And I'm going to be whipped and taken at the back if I don't
very
finish
quickly,
up quickly.
I love the campsite rule. I think it's brilliant. And I think probably more people who consider themselves to be sexually normal should apply that rule, because I hear a lot of discussions about harm and consent in the poly community and in BDSM. I actually don't hear it enough within people who consider themselves to have mainstream sexual interactions. So I think overall we should all be talking about sexual ethics. This is a great conversation to have, and thank you for including me.
Yeah. Gosh.